Death row transfers, the silent system moving America's highest-risk inmates. Most people think death row is a place where inmates wait and never move. But every year, some of the most tightly controlled prisoners in America are taken out of their cells without warning and moved in total silence. These transfers don't appear on public schedules. Families aren't notified. Even other inmates rarely know it's happening. For the person being moved, it begins before sunrise, shackled, isolated, and loaded into transport vehicles with no explanation of where they're going or how long the journey will last. This is not just transportation. It's a hidden system designed to control risk, suppress information, and move high-security inmates out of public view. So why do these transfers happen? Who authorizes them? And why do some inmates come back fundamentally changed? Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The moment the cell door opens. For most death row inmates, routine is the only thing that feels stable. Days blur together inside the same concrete walls, measured by count times, meal trays, and the slow rhythm of isolation. Even in a place built to remove control, predictability becomes a form of survival. The cell stays the same. The range sounds the same. The faces outside the bars rarely change. That's why the moment a transfer begins feels so unsettling. It doesn't start with an announcement. There is no warning posted days in advance. No paperwork slid under the door explaining what's about to happen. In many cases, it starts quietly, often before sunrise, when the unit is at its most silent. The tier lights come on early. Footsteps echo differently than usual. Keys linger longer in locks. For the inmate, the first sign is often the sound of boots stopping directly in front of the cell. Death row officers are trained to keep emotion out of their voices. When they speak, it's short and procedural. Stand up, turn around, back to the door, hands through the slot. There is no explanation attached to these commands. There rarely needs to be. On death row, unexplained movement is never a good sign. Restraints come first. Wrist cuffs tightened, then a waist chain, then leg irons. Each click of metal confirms that this is not a routine escort to showers or recreation. This is a full extraction. And once the restraints are on, questions don't matter anymore. Even if the inmate asks where they're going, the answer, if one comes at all, is usually the same. You'll be informed later. But later often never comes. What makes death row transfers different from standard inmate movement is not just the level of security. It's the secrecy. Unlike court trips or medical transports, these transfers are often classified internally as administrative movements. That designation allows departments of corrections to bypass many of the disclosures required for other transfers. The less information that exists on paper, the less information can leak. From a system's perspective, secrecy is protection. From the inmate's perspective, it's psychological warfare. Once removed from the cell, the inmate is escorted through parts of the prison they may never have seen before. Service corridors, restricted exits, sally ports used only for high-risk movement. These areas are intentionally sterile. No windows, no signage, no sense of direction. It becomes impossible to tell whether you're being taken deeper into the facility or closer to the outside. For many inmates, this is the most disorienting part. Death row is isolating, but it is familiar. The transport phase strips even that away. Outside the unit, transport teams take over. These teams are not ordinary correctional officers. They're trained specifically for high-risk movement, often wearing plain uniforms with minimal identifiers. The fewer names and faces an inmate can remember, the better. Every detail is controlled. Vehicles are staged out of view. Routes are planned to avoid public exposure. In some jurisdictions, multiple vehicles leave at once, even if only one contains the inmate. This isn't theater, it's misdirection. If someone were watching, they wouldn't know which vehicle matters. Once inside the transport vehicle, isolation becomes complete. Windows are either blacked out or designed to limit peripheral vision. Communication is minimal. Some transports involve hours of silence, broken only by radio checks and the sound of tires on asphalt. Others involve multiple transfers between vehicles, increasing confusion and exhaustion. For inmates who have spent years, sometimes decades, in a single facility, this sudden movement triggers intense psychological stress. The body reacts before the mind catches up. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, hypervigilance. Every bump in the road feels loaded with meaning. Is this a move to another death row unit? A transfer for legal reasons? A disciplinary relocation? Or something worse? The system does not clarify, and that ambiguity is not accidental. From an administrative standpoint, death row transfers serve several functions. Some are logistical, overcrowding, facility renovations, or staffing shortages. Others are strategic, separating inmates involved in legal actions, removing individuals considered influential, or responding to intelligence about potential disturbances. But there is another layer rarely discussed publicly: control. Movement disrupts routines, relationships, and legal momentum. An inmate in transit has limited access to attorneys. Property is boxed up or temporarily withheld. Legal paperwork can be delayed or misplaced. Communication slows down. In some cases, pending appeals stall simply because the inmate is no longer where the paperwork expects them to be. None of this requires malicious intent to be effective. It is built into the structure of the process. For families, the experience is equally unsettling. Many learn about transfers days or weeks after they happen, sometimes only when phone calls go unanswered or mail is returned. Visitation schedules vanish overnight. Attorneys scramble to locate their clients. The system rarely considers this a failure. From its perspective, the transfer succeeded. What the public often doesn't realize is that death row transfers are not rare exceptions. They are routine tools of management used quietly and consistently. They happen in the background, outside media attention, without headlines or press releases. And yet, for the person being moved, the transfer often becomes one of the most defining experiences of their incarceration. Former inmates who have survived death row transfers describe the same sensation again and again: a loss of footing. The feeling that the ground has shifted permanently. Even after arriving at a new facility, nothing feels settled. Trust erodes. Sleep becomes harder. Every sound outside the cell raises the question, is it happening again? This lingering uncertainty is not an unintended side effect. It is the byproduct of a system that values risk reduction over psychological stability. From a security standpoint, uncertainty keeps inmates off balance. From a human standpoint, it extracts a cost that rarely appears in official reports. By the time an inmate finally reaches their destination, sometimes hours away, sometimes across state lines, the transfer is already complete in the eyes of the system. Paperwork is signed. Logs are closed. Vehicles return to service. But for the inmate, the transfer has only begun. Because once the movement ends, the consequences start to unfold. New rules, new staff, new interpretations of policy, new risks, and in some cases, new forms of isolation even harsher than before. Death row transfers are not just about moving bodies from one place to another. They are about reshaping control, resetting power, and reminding inmates that no matter how permanent their sentence seems, their environment can change without warning. And that knowledge alone, never knowing when the next knock on the door will come, is often enough to leave lasting damage. The machinery behind the move. Long before a death row inmate feels the restraints tighten around their wrists, the transfer has already been decided somewhere far from the cell block. These decisions are rarely made by a single person. Instead, they emerge from a layered system of approvals, risk assessments, and quiet administrative discussions that most inmates will never see and never be allowed to challenge. At the center of every death row transfer is a classification process. Classification is the invisible spine of the prison system. It determines where inmates are housed, how they move, who they interact with, and how closely they are monitored. On death row, classification takes on an even heavier weight. Every decision is filtered through risk: escape risk, violence risk, legal risk, and reputational risk for the institution itself. When an inmate is flagged for transfer, it often begins with a review that looks routine on paper. Behavior reports, legal status, medical notes, intelligence summaries. But buried inside these files are subjective judgments, phrases like increased influence, potential disruption, or management concern. These terms sound neutral, but they carry enormous power. An inmate doesn't need to break rules to be considered a problem. Filing frequent grievances, assisting other inmates with legal work, attracting outside advocacy attention, or becoming a recognizable name can be enough. In a system built on containment, visibility itself can become a liability. Once concerns are raised, discussions move upward. Unit supervisors consult with wardens. Wardens consult with central administration. In some cases, state-level correctional authorities become involved. Each layer adds distance between the decision and the human being it affects. By the time a transfer is approved, it often appears inevitable, just another line item in an operational plan. What makes death row transfers especially opaque is how they are framed internally. They are rarely described as punitive. Instead, they are labeled as administrative necessity. That phrasing matters. Administrative decisions are harder to appeal, harder to question, and easier to justify if challenged later. In theory, inmates have rights related to transfers. In practice, those rights are narrow. Courts have consistently ruled that prisoners do not have a constitutional right to remain in a specific facility. That legal reality gives corrections departments wide discretion. As long as the transfer does not violate explicit protections, it is almost always upheld. This legal shield allows the system to move quickly and quietly. Timing is another critical element. Transfers are often scheduled during periods of reduced staffing, early mornings, or times when legal offices are closed. This isn't coincidence. It limits the inmate's ability to contact attorneys or advocates before movement begins. Even medical considerations, which might seem like a barrier, are often accommodated rather than questioned. Specialized transport units are equipped to handle inmates with serious health conditions. The presence of medical risk does not stop the transfer. It simply becomes another box checked. Once approval is finalized, coordination begins behind the scenes. Transport teams are assigned. Routes are selected. Receiving facilities are notified with minimal details, often only what is strictly necessary to accept custody. In some cases, even the receiving staff will not know the inmate's full background until arrival. This compartmentalization is deliberate. The fewer people who know the full picture, the fewer opportunities there are for leaks, delays, or interference. One of the most misunderstood aspects of death row transfers is their frequency. The public often assumes death row inmates remain in one place for decades, untouched by movement. In reality, transfers occur far more often than most people realize. Some inmates are moved multiple times across different facilities, sometimes within the same state, sometimes across jurisdictions. Each move resets the environment. Policies vary from prison to prison. What was permitted in one facility may be prohibited in another. Property limits change. Visitation rules shift. Access to legal resources fluctuates. Even the interpretation of the same written policy can differ depending on staff culture. For inmates actively pursuing appeals, these changes can be devastating. Legal work depends on consistency, access to documents, predictable schedules, stable communication. A transfer disrupts all of it at once. Boxes go missing. Deadlines slip. Familiar legal aids are left behind. Again, none of this needs to be intentional to be effective. From the institution's perspective, transfers are risk management tools. They diffuse tension. They prevent inmates from establishing long-term influence. They allow administrators to respond quickly to perceived threats without lengthy disciplinary proceedings. But there's a cost that rarely enters official calculations. Psychologically, repeated transfers reinforce a sense of powerlessness. Inmates learn that no amount of compliance guarantees stability. Even good behavior offers no protection from sudden displacement. Over time, this erodes motivation, trust, and mental resilience. Some former death row inmates describe transfers as more destabilizing than disciplinary segregation. Solitary confinement is brutal, but at least it is predictable. Transfers are not. They arrive without warning and rewrite the inmate's reality overnight. Staff are not immune to the strain either. Transport teams operate under intense pressure. One mistake, one lapse in procedure, can have catastrophic consequences. That pressure often translates into emotional distance. Interactions become mechanical, stripped of empathy not out of cruelty, but out of survival. The system trains everyone involved to focus on procedure, not people. By the time the transport vehicle rolls out, the transfer has already done its job from an administrative standpoint. Risk has been redistributed. Control has been reasserted. The inmate has been removed from whatever context made them inconvenient. What remains unseen is the cumulative effect of these decisions over time. One transfer may be survivable. Several begin to reshape how an inmate thinks, reacts, and copes. Anxiety becomes chronic. Trust disappears. Every routine moment carries the possibility of disruption. And this is where the silent system shows its true power, not in force, but in uncertainty. Because once an inmate understands that they can be moved at any time, for reasons they may never know, the prison no longer needs to act as aggressively. The possibility alone is enough. Death row transfers are not just logistical operations. They are mechanisms of control woven deeply into the structure of incarceration. They function quietly, legally, and efficiently, out of sight and largely out of mind. But their impact follows inmates long after the transport ends. And now it's time we'll step inside the transfer itself, examining what happens during the journey, where the real dangers emerge, and why the hours on the road often leave deeper scars than the years spent waiting on death row. Inside the transport, where control replaces time, almost equals 1,300 words. Once the transport vehicle leaves the prison perimeter, time stops behaving normally. For death row inmates, the journey itself is often the most psychologically intense phase of the entire transfer. Inside the vehicle, stripped of visual reference points and human context, minutes stretch unpredictably. Hours blur. Without clocks, windows, or clear communication, the body loses its sense of progression. The mind fills the gap with speculation. Transport vehicles are designed for control, not comfort. Seating is rigid, restraints are fixed, and movement is deliberately restricted. Every design choice serves one purpose: minimizing risk. But in doing so, it amplifies vulnerability. Inmates are typically restrained at multiple points: hands, waist, legs, and sometimes additional security measures are applied depending on classification. These restraints remain in place for the duration of the transport, regardless of length. Breaks, when they occur, are tightly controlled and infrequent. Silence is the default. For many inmates, the first realization sets in quickly. They are completely dependent on the system for everything: movement, water, bathroom access, even basic medical response. Any discomfort, injury, or distress must be reported to the very people tasked with enforcing restraint. This imbalance is not accidental. During transport, control is absolute. Routes are rarely direct. Transport plans often include deliberate detours, staggered stops, or vehicle swaps designed to reduce predictability. In some cases, inmates are moved through multiple facilities in a single transfer, each stop adding another layer of disorientation. Arrival times are not shared. Destinations are not confirmed. The result is a journey that feels endless. Physically, transport takes a toll. Prolonged restraint causes muscle stiffness, circulation issues, and pain that intensifies the longer the journey lasts. For inmates with pre-existing conditions, heart problems, joint issues, respiratory illness, the stress compounds quickly. But the deeper damage is psychological. In the absence of information, the mind turns inward. Every sound becomes amplified. A sudden stop raises questions. A change in engine noise suggests a new phase. Conversations between officers often clipped and procedural, feel loaded with meaning even when they are not. Is this a routine stop? Is something wrong? Is this the destination? Not knowing is the point. Unlike incarceration inside a facility, transport removes all familiar structure. There are no schedules, no routines, no predictable checks. The inmate exists in a suspended state, neither here nor there, held entirely at the discretion of others. Former inmates often describe this phase as a loss of identity. Inside a prison, even on death row, people develop a sense of place. During transport, that disappears. The inmate becomes cargo, secured, tracked, and delivered. Even basic human needs are reframed as risks. Asking to use the restroom requires stopping the vehicle, securing a location, and coordinating staff. Some inmates avoid asking altogether, choosing discomfort over perceived inconvenience or scrutiny. This suppression of need is not enforced overtly. It emerges naturally from the environment. Transport officers are trained to remain neutral. Emotional engagement is discouraged. Friendly conversation can blur boundaries. Silence maintains distance. From a safety standpoint, this makes sense. From a human standpoint, it deepens isolation. Most transport teams are not cruel. They are procedural. But procedure, repeated without context, can feel indistinguishable from indifference. The most dangerous moments during transport are rarely dramatic. They are subtle. A delayed medical response. A restraint adjusted too tightly. A miscommunication during a stop. Fatigue after long hours on the road. Because transfers often span multiple jurisdictions, responsibility shifts frequently. One team hands off to another. Vehicles change. Documentation updates lag behind reality. Each transition introduces risk. If something goes wrong, accountability becomes diffuse. For inmates, this uncertainty is terrifying. During the journey, there is no advocate, no familiar officer, no one with a vested interest in their well-being beyond protocol. Complaints may be noted, but resolution is deferred until arrival, if it comes at all. Sleep deprivation is common. Vehicles are noisy. Seating is uncomfortable. The mind remains alert, unable to relax in an unfamiliar, high-stress environment. By the time the destination is reached, inmates are often physically exhausted and mentally frayed. This state matters. Arrival is not a reset. It is a continuation of the transfer's impact. Inmates arrive disoriented, restrained, and vulnerable, often processed quickly into new systems without time to recover. First impressions form under extreme stress, shaping how inmates perceive and interact with staff at the new facility. Some inmates arrive compliant and withdrawn. Others arrive tense and reactive. Staff may interpret these behaviors without understanding the journey that preceded them. This misalignment creates friction from the start. Transport is also where many inmates internalize a critical lesson: movement equals danger. Even after settling into a new facility, the memory of transport lingers. The sound of keys, the sight of restraints, the mention of movement can trigger anxiety responses long after the event. In this way, the transfer extends beyond the physical journey. It rewires perception. What the public rarely sees is that transport is not just a means to an end. It is an experience that reshapes how inmates understand their place within the system. It reinforces dependency. It reinforces uncertainty. And it reinforces the reality that control can be exercised without explanation. From the outside, a transfer looks like logistics. From the inside, it feels like erasure. By the time the vehicle stops for the final time and the doors open, the inmate has already been changed by the journey. Whatever awaits on the other side, new rules, new faces, new forms of confinement, will be filtered through the exhaustion and stress accumulated along the way. And that is when the next phase begins. Because arrival does not bring relief, it brings adjustment. And for many inmates, adjustment is where the long-term damage sets in. Arrival without welcome, resetting life from zero. When the transport finally stops, there is no sense of arrival, only transition. For death row inmates, Reaching a new facility does not mean the ordeal is over. In many ways, it marks the beginning of a quieter, more lasting phase of the transfer's impact. The vehicle doors open, restraints remain in place, and unfamiliar voices issue the same short commands heard hours or days earlier. Step down. Stay still. Wait. The first thing inmates notice is how different everything feels. Every prison has its own rhythm. The sounds are different. The way officers move, speak, and observe varies from facility to facility. Even the air feels unfamiliar. For inmates who have spent years in one institution, these subtle differences are jarring. Nothing signals safety. Nothing signals familiarity. Processing begins immediately. Paperwork is checked and rechecked. Identification numbers are confirmed. Property inventories are compared against transport logs. Any discrepancy, missing paperwork, delayed medical files, incomplete property transfers can stall the process. While administrators resolve these issues, the inmate waits, often restrained, often isolated, sometimes for hours. This waiting is not idle. It is loaded with uncertainty. The inmate does not yet know where they will be housed, what restrictions will apply, or how this facility interprets death row policy. Even within the same state, death row units can differ dramatically. Some allow limited out-of-cell movement. Others enforce near total isolation. Some permit contact visits. Others eliminate them entirely. Until classification is finalized, the inmate exists in limbo. Medical screenings follow. These are typically brief, procedural, and focused on liability rather than care. Vital signs are checked. Conditions are noted. Complaints may be recorded, but treatment is rarely immediate unless the issue is acute. Fatigue, stress, and pain from transport are considered expected side effects, not emergencies. Mental health evaluations, when they occur, are often superficial. Anxiety, confusion, and withdrawal are difficult to distinguish from baseline death row behavior. The system is not designed to unpack the psychological toll of transfer. It is designed to move forward. Housing assignments are made quickly. Space availability often matters more than continuity or suitability. Inmates may be placed in temporary holding cells, segregation units, or intake areas before reaching their final housing location. These spaces are often more restrictive than standard death row cells. Isolation deepens. Once inside a new cell, the inmate begins the process of recalibration. What rules apply here? What behaviors are tolerated? Which routines matter? These questions are not answered explicitly. They are learned through observation and, sometimes, through punishment. Trust is at its lowest point during this phase. The inmate does not know the staff. Staff do not know the inmate. Each side assesses the other cautiously. Officers may rely on transport notes or prior records, which rarely capture the full context of the inmate's behavior or mental state. First impressions carry weight. For inmates who arrive exhausted or withdrawn, silence may be interpreted as noncompliance. For those who arrive tense or reactive, stress may be read as aggression. Misinterpretations are common, and consequences can follow quickly. Property delays compound the strain. Legal documents, personal letters, and approved items may arrive days or weeks later, or not at all. Without paperwork, inmates cannot continue legal work. Without contact lists, communication stalls. Without personal items, even small comforts disappear. Each delay reinforces the sense of erasure. Family members and attorneys often struggle to locate transferred inmates during this period. Phone systems differ. Registration processes take time. Calls go unanswered. Visits are canceled or postponed. From the outside, it can feel like the inmate has vanished. Inside, that feeling is mutual. The most destabilizing aspect of arrival is the loss of momentum. Whatever routines the inmate had built, legal schedules, mental coping strategies, communication habits, are disrupted. The system does not pause to allow adjustment. Expectations apply immediately. For some inmates, this triggers withdrawal. They become quiet, compliant, and disengaged. For others, frustration surfaces. Minor rule violations increase. Requests for information multiply. Each reaction carries risk. Staff operate under their own pressures. New arrivals require monitoring. Death row inmates carry reputational weight. Any incident reflects poorly on the institution. As a result, caution dominates. Restrictions tighten. Privileges are withheld until trust is established, if it ever is. This creates a feedback loop. The inmate, already destabilized by transfer, encounters heightened control. Heightened control increases stress. Stress affects behavior. Behavior reinforces institutional caution. Over time, the environment hardens. What is rarely acknowledged is how long this adjustment phase lasts. Officially, intake is complete once housing is assigned and paperwork is filed. In reality, psychological adjustment can take months. Sometimes it never fully resolves. Former inmates often describe a lingering sense of displacement long after arrival. Even once routines settle, the memory of sudden movement remains. Stability feels temporary. Every unusual sound or procedural change raises suspicion. Is this another transfer? Is this another reset? This constant vigilance extracts a quiet toll. Sleep suffers. Concentration weakens. Emotional regulation declines. These effects do not show up in incident reports, but they shape daily behavior. From the institution's perspective, the transfer achieved its objective. The inmate has been relocated. Risk has been redistributed. The system moves on. From the inmate's perspective, the ground has shifted permanently. The arrival phase reveals the true nature of death row transfers. They are not isolated events. They are sequences, decisions, movement, arrival, adjustment, each compounding the last. The physical journey may be over, but the psychological journey continues. And for inmates who experience multiple transfers, this cycle repeats. Each time, recovery becomes harder. Trust thins further. The sense of permanence erodes. By the time an inmate realizes they have settled into the new facility, another truth often sets in. Nothing about this placement is guaranteed. Stability is conditional. Silence is safer than visibility. Compliance does not protect against movement. And that realization shapes everything that comes next. Because in the final chapter, we'll examine what happens over time, how repeated transfers reshape behavior, mental health, and survival itself on death row, long after the transport vehicles are gone. When movement becomes the sentence. By the time a death row inmate has been transferred more than once, the meaning of movement changes completely. What began as a single disruptive event slowly turns into a pattern, one that reshapes behavior, perception, and survival itself. The sentence is no longer defined only by confinement or the looming reality of execution. It is defined by instability, by the knowledge that nothing, not even the cell you sleep in, is permanent. Repeated transfers create a specific kind of psychological erosion. Each move chips away at the idea of control. Inmates learn that compliance does not guarantee stability. Silence does not guarantee safety. Legal progress does not guarantee consistency. Over time, hope stops attaching itself to place and starts shrinking inward. This is where the system's quiet power becomes most visible. Transfers do not need to be frequent to be effective. The possibility alone is enough. Once an inmate understands that they can be relocated at any moment, behavior changes naturally. Some withdraw completely, minimizing interaction to avoid attention. Others become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signs of another move. Neither response is healthy, but both are adaptive. Mental health deterioration often accelerates at this stage. Anxiety becomes chronic rather than situational. Sleep patterns fragment. Concentration fades. Inmates describe living in a permanent state of readiness, as if bracing for impact that never fully arrives. And because death row already imposes extreme isolation, there are few outlets for processing the stress. Counseling services are limited. Mental health check-ins are brief. Symptoms that would trigger intervention in the outside world, paranoia, emotional numbness, intrusive thoughts, are often normalized inside death row. The system sees survival, not well-being. What makes transfer-related trauma particularly damaging is its invisibility. Unlike disciplinary actions or solitary confinement, transfers leave no obvious mark. There is no incident report detailing psychological impact. No formal acknowledgement that harm occurred. On paper, the inmate was simply moved, but behavior tells a different story. Inmates who once maintained routines stop doing so. Legal filings slow or cease. Communication with family drops off. Emotional responses flatten. Others swing in the opposite direction, becoming reactive, suspicious, or easily agitated. Staff may interpret these changes as attitude problems or disciplinary risks, not as symptoms of cumulative stress. This misinterpretation matters. Increased surveillance and restriction often follow perceived instability. Privileges are tightened. Movement within the facility is reduced. Requests are denied more frequently. Each measure is justified individually, but together they deepen isolation. The inmate becomes harder to manage, not because they are dangerous, but because they are breaking down. For some, transfers indirectly shorten life expectancy on death row. Stress exacerbates existing health conditions. Medication schedules are disrupted. Continuity of care suffers. Small issues go untreated until they become serious. Again, none of this requires malicious intent. It is the result of a system optimized for control rather than continuity. Over years, the cumulative effect of transfers can reshape identity itself. Inmates stop seeing themselves as residents of a facility and start seeing themselves as temporary occupants of a system that never settles. Belonging disappears. Even resentment loses focus. What remains is endurance. Survival on death row becomes less about navigating daily routines and more about enduring uncertainty. Some inmates describe this as the most exhausting aspect of their sentence. Not the isolation, not the sentence itself, but the constant readiness for disruption. Families feel this erosion too. Each transfer resets communication. New phone systems, new visitation rules, new approval processes. Relationships strain under repeated disruption. Some families disengage, not out of lack of care, but exhaustion. The emotional toll becomes too heavy. From the outside, the inmate appears increasingly isolated. From the inside, that isolation feels imposed rather than chosen. The system rarely reflects on this outcome. Transfers are measured by success metrics that exclude human cost. Was the inmate moved safely? Were procedures followed? Were incidents avoided? If yes, the transfer is considered successful. What those metrics ignore is what happens afterward. Death row transfers, when repeated or poorly managed, can function as an unacknowledged extension of punishment. They add instability to an already extreme sentence. They introduce uncertainty where little control remains. In this way, movement becomes part of the punishment itself. By the time an inmate reaches the later years of their sentence, the fear of transfer often outweighs the fear of the known. Familiar suffering becomes preferable to unpredictable change. Stability, even harsh stability, feels safer than uncertainty. This reversal reveals something uncomfortable about the system. A structure designed to manage risk through movement may ultimately create deeper instability. Not riots, not escapes, but quiet psychological collapse that never makes headlines. And that collapse stays invisible unless someone chooses to look closely. Which brings us to the end of this story, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a reality rarely acknowledged. Death row transfers are not just logistical necessities. They're silent forces shaping lives in ways the public is never meant to see. The system that never stops moving. Death row transfers are rarely talked about, rarely documented, and almost never questioned. They happen quietly, under the justification of security and administration, far from public view. But for the inmates who experience them, these moves are not temporary disruptions. They become defining moments, reshaping trust, stability, and the ability to endure life on death row. This documentary did not follow a single inmate, a single prison, or a single state. It followed a system, one that relies on silence, uncertainty, and movement to maintain control. And as long as that system remains unseen, its impact will continue unnoticed, measured only in paperwork, not in lives. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.